This lecture is being organized by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, South Asia. I now hand it over to Dr. Sandeepan Bakshi, the director of the foundation, to give a brief introduction to FAS, the topic at hand, and start the proceedings of the lecture. Over to you, Sandeepan.
Thank you, Sujan. And hello all. Good afternoon to those joining us from this part of the world, and good morning and good evening, depending on wherever you are joining us today from. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, or FAS, I welcome you all to this online public lecture on climate change and agriculture in India, a topic whose relevance in contemporary times needs no emphasis. FAS, as many of you would already know, is a research organization based in Bangalore, India, with the major objective to facilitate multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and elsewhere in developing and less developed countries. Some of the major activities that we have been engaged with in the past couple of decades include a program of village studies, under which we have surveyed about 27 villages across 12 states in the country, villages that lie in diverse agroecological and socio-economic regions of India. We are regularly conduct thematic projects on wide range of issues pertaining to agricultural production and rural development. Some of the more recent research projects that we have undertaken include a research project on the small farming economy of India, very eminent and important work on women and work in rural India, and more recently on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown on Indian countryside. Our work on these themes is based on hard evidence and scientific method. We regularly publish the findings of our research in two book series, the first being the Socio-Economic Survey book series, and the other book series called the Agrarian Studies series, where we publish the results of our thematic projects. We also have an in-house journal, Review of Agrarian Studies. The website is ras.org.in. It's a peer-reviewed open source journal and has been recognized by various associations and commissions across the globe. It's a journal of international repute. In addition, we also regularly conduct conferences and workshops for students, for young scholars working on agriculture production, on rural development, workshops for with the academic community, with peasants and agriculture workers organizations, and with women's associations. I would also like to highlight that we work as a network of academics and other scholars, and are supported by progressive organizations and donor agencies that are interested in promoting research to eradicate hunger, poverty, and malnutrition, promote gender equality, and research on measures to reduce social and economic inequalities. And it gives me great pleasure to say that today's speaker, Professor T. Jayaraman, Senior Fellow Climate Change at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, is a long-standing partner in this network. Now, about the lecture, so I would just like to say that in 2014, almost a decade ago, Professor Jayaraman co-authored a paper titled Climate Change and Agriculture, Current and Future Trends and Implications for India. This was published in our journal, the Review of Agrarian Studies, and covered three major aspects of the issue of climate change and agriculture. First, the paper described in detail the significant advances in climate science that were relevant to understanding the impact of global warming on agriculture. It also introduced to us the significance of climate variability, both in present and in future for agriculture production. And it also highlighted some of the implications of climate variability for the study of economic impact of climate change. Most importantly, I think what it did was it focused on the need to understand the differential impact of climate change on agriculture across both spatial and temporal scales and across different socioeconomic strata of producers. The paper established that the impact of climate change in an Indian village is not uniform, and this differentiated impact was in accordance with the socioeconomic differentiation that was and continues to be the reality of Indian villages. 10 years since the paper, much has changed in the field and many more studies have appeared. We come across new narratives around agriculture and climate change, and the politics around the issue of sustainability has changed markedly. It is in this context that we planned this lecture in collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia, and we are hopeful that this lecture will bring us to speed on the subject and help us make sense of the current debates around it. The chair for today's lecture, let me just introduce you briefly. He is Dr. Vinod Kumar Singh, an eminent scholar of climate resilient agriculture in India, among other things, and the director of the Central Research Institute for Dryland Agriculture and ICAR Institute, CREDA, based in Hyderabad. Dr. Singh also serves as the Joint Director of Extension as an additional charge, and is the head of the Division of Agronomy of IARI, Indian Agriculture Research Institute, the ICAR Institute. Dr. Singh is a Rafi Ahmed Kidwai awardee and a fellow of the National Academy of Agriculture Sciences, and he serves in many advisory and research committees. Unfortunately, however, Dr. Singh is caught up in some other sudden engagement and would be able to join us midway, after a few minutes. So without any further ado, let me right away call Professor Jayaraman to take the floor and deliver his lecture. Professor Jayaraman.
Thank you, Sandeepan, for this generous introduction. It's a pleasure to sorry. My share accidentally disappeared. So you just have to give me a minute where I find it again. Yep. Okay. Thank you. So these are the small issues of online. Thank you very much. And I have, on various occasions, have been in conversation with the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and have, on the subject of climate change and agriculture. And I have also benefited a great deal from the work of the foundation, especially its focus on small farmers and the whole issue of inequalities in agrarian and rural India. So I have greatly benefited also from our interaction. So here is something of an update, as you had suggested, of a discussion that we began some 8-9 years ago. At that time, we had expressed the hope that perhaps we could move in a direction where the small farmer would be more the center of the debate, and the development of lives and livelihoods of a large portion of not only rural India, but rural areas throughout the global south would be under greater focus, even in the era of climate change. Unfortunately, what has happened is that things have moved in a somewhat different direction at the policy level. So we are faced with more challenges than we anticipated at that time. what they are is perhaps the burden of my lecture today. And the small farmer is, of course, invoked partly in, one may say, in a ritual sense, like an appeal to nature is invoked in a romantic sense. But the problems of lives and livelihoods of the small farmer seem to be receding yet again, even further in the debate, especially at the global level. So let me proceed further, and I'll come to why I have this somewhat, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but sort of concerned assessment that I have of the current situation. So, to the issue at hand. So, in today's lecture, I'll be focusing on four issues. I just want to make a few comments on the impact of global warming on agricultural production. Basically, I think the message is that the broad observations have not changed, but I think there's much more detail available in the literature. The second is I would want to emphasize once again the nexus between adaptation and development. This is important because of, the attempt perhaps to downplay what is development or to conflate development with climate action itself. And we would like to emphasize once again the importance of the growth in production and productivity of incomes and livelihoods, and remind everybody of the importance of SDG 2 in all its aspects, including that of doubling productivity and doubling farmers' incomes. The third issue is to revisit the question of agriculture as the site of adaptation or mitigation. India has a definite policy choice. I think there is a broad consensus both politically and across civil society, but this consensus is being eroded in serious ways. So I think we need to talk about it a little. Finally, I would really like to say something about the global context of the current discourses on climate change and agriculture, the emergence of a conservation agenda and the sidelining of productivity growth, the shift to something which is called food systems, and it appears to be a very integrated and holistic perspective, but precisely in its integrative nature, it raises some very serious questions. There is also the much bandied about term nature-based solutions, and we are witnessing a larger push by multilateral institutions across the world, pushing especially the global south towards mitigation in agriculture. So these are issues, these are four topics. Perhaps none of them I'd be able to go into in as much detail as either you or I would like, but I will touch upon all four, and perhaps we can say a little more and add to it in the discussion. So, yes. So the overall threat of global warming to agriculture is well established. IPCC 6 assessment report, which is now complete with the publication of the synthesis report, confirmed this. But at the same time, it is important to keep note of the fact that agricultural productivity and production continues to rise steadily, both absolute and per capita. So we can see this This is data from the FAO filtered through the quite helpful Our World in Data web portal. So this is global cereal production. It is steadily increasing over time from 1961. In total production in recent years, in the last decade or so, you can see that India, for instance, has overtaken the European Union. These increases vary across regions and over time. We are not currently digging into the picture of for individual crops, where again there will be variation across crops and regions and over time. But the secular trend is definitely upwards, and there is no indication that a secular downward trend or even a plateauing is taking place. The next issue, the other thing I mentioned was productivity. So yields are also rising. They are rising at varying rates. It's particularly problematic, and you can see this very clearly here, that in Africa as a whole, and if you take all low-income countries in the World Bank classification, the rise in productivity is quite modest. If you know it, there's a problem with percentages. So if you look at percentages, perhaps in particular crops, they will look more significant. But in absolute terms, you can see the enormous lag. India is not a front runner, as you can see very clearly, more of that later. But all said and done, yields are rising. And you again here see no downward trends or plateauing. The secular trend is upward. We just point to note here that the productivity is not only a function of level of development, but it also climatic and non-climatic factors, ecological factors, etc., would determine the rate of increase of productivity and to what level it rises. So that's just something to keep in mind. A very important point to remember about global agriculture production is that synthetic fertilizer use remains critical to production and productivity. So a lot of interest, and I think sometimes for the wrong reasons in the regulation of fertilizer use. It is definitely true that excess fertilizer use beyond the needs of optimal crop production is important and an issue, especially in terms of local pollution. But one must at the same time remember that the actual fertilizer use in the field by farmers, not only as individuals, but the farming community in agriculture crop production across regions, across country, across the world, they are highly also sensitive to social and economic conditions. So it is not enough to desire the reduction or optimization of fertilizer use, but one really needs to understand what are the drivers that determine current patterns. But in any case, that's not the subject of our discussion in such detail today. We will just continue, but just note its importance. Here again, we must note that sub-Saharan Africa, and it applies to Africa, I think, as a whole, the fertilizer level use are very low, and this is a particular issue for Africa in the context of climate change. The final issue is what are the emissions from agriculture, and you can see here a detailed table. There is a reason I have presented this table in this form. because there is a lot of careless talk that takes place. Unfortunately, I recently found echoed even on the web page of the UNFCCC, who should really know better. But, we'll get to why that happens. And this is conflating emissions from agriculture with what is called food system emissions, which are what are referred to as life cycle emissions. So you can estimate emissions in two ways. One way of estimating emissions is to the actual agricultural production process. What are the emissions that result? There is not any discernible CO2 emissions in agriculture as such. Then there is methane use, methane emissions which come from enteric fermentation of livestock. And there is also from the use of nitrogenous fertilizers. Similarly, there is fertilizer use and fertilizer use, of course, leads to nitrous oxide. Methane from the submersion and decay of vegetative matter in the field, especially paddy cultivation. So here you have methane emissions. So if you look at that, and if you look at these emissions alone, and if you look at agriculture, you see that agriculture contributes in this column. You see only about 6.2 gigatons, billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is out of a total of 52. So this is this other is forestry and land use. So this is the percentages are clear. Of course, methane is an important part of agriculture. It's an important part of just methane emissions, contributing about 44%. But then more recently, there has been increasing concern that the estimates of methane from natural gas and petroleum related activity has been seriously underestimated. So this is somewhat up in the air at the moment. Then, of course, there are what is referred to as food system emissions. So, there is other sectors. They come from land use change. Then this is, of course, on the left-hand side, the original reproduction of what we had above. But then here you see that there are pre to post production. And here very often, depending on how they calculate it, all kinds of the emissions in urea production is added. The emissions of the equipment such as tractors, etc., are added. So a whole variety of other emissions which are connected with not just crop production, but the use of industrial goods in agriculture is connected. Now, by the and not only their use, but also, for instance, if you use electricity, then they would like to count the emissions associated with electricity generation. So by that token, you can end up arguing that a third of global emissions comes from agriculture, or 30%. Which is somewhat surprising, but because it seems like those who fly around in private jets or those who drive SUVs across the world are not as responsible, and the focus really should be on farmers. So it is really has to do with accounting. It is also, this table will show you also that that the natural response of land to human-induced environmental change leads actually to increased absorption of carbon dioxide. So vegetative growth increases. This is called carbon fertilization. Carbon fertilization was considered to be perhaps beneficial to agriculture, but that I think cannot be should not be overstated. The effect is minimal. But on the other hand, if you see for vegetative growth in general, the response of land to human-induced climate change is still that of a sink. And so if you take land sector as a whole, you see that this constitutes a net sink. And this, of course, does not quite apply to, we are not talking about methane, etc. We are talking only of carbon dioxide. So there is this net sink effect of land, okay, basically from forest and vegetative cover. So one very important point to note is that, especially given the alarmist language in which you talk about, one hears talk about agriculture in the era of climate change, you see here that there is still considerable potential for increasing yield productivity. This is an illustration. For the case of rice, other crops have been studied in the literature, and chapter 5 of working group 2 of the IPCC AR6 gives a detailed picture. So in this pie chart, the red portion is the yield gap, and the actual yield is the yellow portion. In India, they have looked at two rice cropping systems. One is the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The second is South India, IS. The I that you see as the third letter, I or R, is rain-fed or irrigated, and the last consists of another the rice cropping intensity. So you have S would be single crop, D would be double crop, and there are locations like, say, Vietnam, where you can see also a third crop. So this shows nevertheless the distribution of yield gaps across the world. So it's very important to remember that when there is talk of the decline, the impact of climate change on agriculture, it's the real test of whether one has things in focus is the extent to which the question of yield gaps and the scope for increasing yield is also factored into the narrative. So this is the global picture. I think there are no dramatic changes, but there are issues that have been deepened. There are further study of particular crops, but there are also important gaps which remain, which have not been filled, even those which were noted at the time of the 5th assessment report. So what about the situation in India? And here, I would really want to focus in this lecture on some simple estimates that we have done especially of yield gaps in Indian agriculture. They are straightforward computations, but these are issues which unfortunately are tending to be blurred in the current discussion. So I would really like to emphasize this. So overall, agricultural growth, growth of crop production in India and overall in agriculture, including all sectors, continues to be positive. There is, of course, a mixed pattern of trends in rates of growth across crops and regions. There are deficiencies in the case of coarse cereals, or what we used to be called coarse cereals, millets, etc. Deficiencies in the case of pulse production and so on. But nevertheless, if you take the aggregate, as I have already shown you for the case of cereals, and the same picture repeats for lentils, vegetables, fruits, etc. Overall, agriculture growth is positive. So there is no clear signal of any slowdown of trends because of climate change. It is true that in India and across the world, to varying extent, there is a depressor effect on growth in productivity because of climate of ongoing global warming. But nevertheless, it is very clear that technology and technological development in agriculture is still able to outrun the impact of oncoming global warming. So this, unfortunately, is a message that IPCC Working Group 2 was reluctant to put out very clearly. We will, if there is interest in this, we can discuss this further during the Q&A. So the point we wish to emphasize is that compared to global productivity figures, we lag significantly. With current technology, significant yield gaps exist, which can be overcome. And so here is a sort of a snapshot. We are looking only at 3 crops here: wheat, rice, and maize. And we are looking here at how India stands with respect to ranking of India with respect to area, production, and productivity. So you see here that in the case of maize, India's standing is 5th in productivity. That is true also in rice, and that is in the case of wheat, it is the 4th. Now, this is a very important point, and I think it's useful to know where this comes from. It's perhaps an immediate reaction would be to say, well, conditions of production are very different in different parts of the world. So maybe that is the reason. But then you can examine the question internally with respect to India. And this is some work that I did with my colleague, Isaac Mana, who's now in Sussex. We did an estimate of what we call the climatic yield gap. And this is basically you look at the basic agroclimatic zones classified only by precipitation and evapotranspiration. There are 5 climatic zones in that respect. And then you take the district which has the highest yield, and you look at what are the other yields in the other district in the same agroclimatic zone, and that difference you call the yield gap. So it says that, basically you are saying that what is the scope for increasing production by comparison to the highest yielding districts. So we have looked at it in the case of 4 or 5 crops, cereal crops. There are some unpublished results on other crops as well, but the pattern is striking, and we have looked at also the correlates, and it is very clear that these yield gaps are correlated positively with fertilizer use and negatively with the incidence of small farmers. So scale and input use really help determine the nature of the quantum of the yield gap. So here is a box plot of the variation in yield gap across districts from each of the climatic zones. It looks strange that arid, the yield gap is much lower, but that is because you don't grow rice in arid regions without intensive irrigation. So that obviously makes up for the rainfall deficit. So this is just by way of illustration. Similarly, we can tell the story of wheat. And the distribution here is important. This is something I think we can go into at a deeper level. One can, I think, learn a lot more by perhaps going down even to a finer level than the district. But the point to make here is that substantial yield gaps are there. So we have looked at what is the potential increase in production. So we have looked at it separately in each agroclimatic zone. We are also looking at it overall for the country. And you can see here that if you consider the last column, you see for rice, you see the production. These are for 2017, for which we have the data. Sorry, yes. And so you see the potential increase in production is close to a doubling, okay, or almost 90%. So it is not to say that all of this is realizable, but even if we had a further increase in production beyond, say if we increased it by 50%, that would still be a substantial increase. So this is very important. So what we must remember here is that it is important not to simply conflate or confuse, mix up the question of adaptation and even less that of mitigation with production. I have not gone into the detail here, but this productivity increase is not some luxury we are seeking. Such increases in production and productivity will be important going forward as our population continues to rise, as we improve levels of consumption. A lot of this production actually caters to low consumption levels, improve consumption. So increasing production and productivity is a necessity. And from that point of view, these potential increases in production are very important to know. So, of course, this is not to say, and this is another problem of the climate change and agriculture debate, even when they are focused on adaptation. But when we say production, productivity is not just obsession with yield as a number. This is not, we shouldn't have this bogey like people have about GDP and the larger economic trend. We are not an obsession with the number, but that the production is important. And it's not just yield as a number, but the supply of new varieties, whether the varietal replacement rates are adequate, whether optimal input use is taking place or input use is imbalanced, which may affect the production and productivity. So so the yield, as it were, is a signal, and yield gaps are a signal. And we by no means are underestimating the kind of work that is required to go forward and close the yield gap. The other point, of course, is that of the larger question of the agrarian transition. I'll just turn to some aspects of it in a thing. But somehow this whole climate change debate in agriculture occurs as if the question of the agrarian transition, the fact that large numbers of people would move out of agriculture as development proceeds, and this is in the nature of development, is intrinsic to that. This whole issue is simply swept under the carpet, and that's not even a subject of discussion. So that is very disturbing, because that means that you really have no serious idea of the question of lives and livelihoods in the era of climate change, notwithstanding your sort of rhetorical use of those words. So I think one other very important aspect is, and this I think we have distinctly made progress in the last 10 years. I think learning from current variability, of course, sometimes we across the country, various sections of society, we react, perhaps overreact, both in government, outside, media, even among scientists. But nevertheless, we have come to appreciate the importance of climate variability and the current climate variability as a window into a future of global warming. So variability in temperature is most significant for Rabi crops, rainfall most significant for Kharif crops. This is something we had started speaking about 10, 15 years ago. Outside, by started discussing, I meant outside a narrow circle of specialists who are, of course, aware of this. But this is now part of the larger policy discourse, this awareness of climate extremes and climate variability. But nevertheless, this is not just looking at the overall trends, secular trends. It shows that while locally and for particular regions, or even for the country as a whole in particular years, climate extremes may have a discernible impact, economic and in terms of production. Nevertheless, the overall trends are not yet impacted. So this is still to be emphasized. This is a favorite picture of ours, is work that I did with my colleagues Sandeep Mahato and Kamal Murari. Now, of course, the whole country is aware of this relation. You remember the excitement, was it last year or was it early this year about, high March temperatures last year, I think, in 2022. And of course, the fact that if there are higher than optimal temperatures in the final, in the last stages of the wheat crop, then yields will decline. I am from Swaminathan, Swaminathan Research Foundation, and this, of course, was one of Professor Swaminathan's signal insights, first great insights into climate change and agriculture. But, perhaps the government of India overreacted to the possibility of a decline in yields because of the rise in late season temperatures around February or March last year. But that we can go into in discussion. But more importantly, you can see that extreme temperatures, if the occurrence of extremes push the accelerate the decline in yield, which take place with the total heat to exposure. So this suggests to us the point that we had made earlier, that extreme temperatures should be thought of as a independent variable from the average growing temperature in the season. So similar analysis has been done for crops in Karnataka, and here also, while there are no trends that you see overall of climate change, nevertheless, the impact of extreme temperatures are visible for some crops in particular regions. So this is useful. This is also useful in short-term agriculture planning. This is a useful and important paper by Arvind Subramaniam, the former chief economic advisor, and his colleagues. And this really illustrates what, of course, the IMD and the ICAR had been saying, somewhat, I must say, qualitatively for many years, that the impact of climate extremes is quite sharp, and the gain from a good year, above normal good year, is not comparable to is less than the loss in a bad year. And this kind of analysis
I think we've lost some connection.
Yeah, Dr. Jayaraman, there is some disconnection at your end. Dr. Jayaraman.
Give us a few minutes. We'll just try to get in touch with him.
Yeah.
Am I back?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah,
You're
back.
Just Dr. Singh, you are here. Okay.
Yeah. I'm listening you from last 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. It is, I have to share as gone. Huh?
yes,
Yeah.
sir.
This one. How much more? How much time have I taken so far? 25 minutes or more?
We're close to 45 minutes.
Oh my, no, that's if you started at 3. So
TJ, Professor Jayaraman, you have taken about 30 minutes of your time.
yes, that sounds more reasonable. Thank you. So let me, so climate extremes and climate variability are still the issue. I am sorry to say that, we have made little progress in dealing with what remains the central human question of climate change and agriculture. And that is the problem of small farmers. So let me say that on the one hand, the withdrawal of public investment in agriculture, public finance for agriculture, public support to agriculture, the fact that small farmers cannot simply be left to markets and they need support, and in the era of climate change, they need increased support, is something which simply has not penetrated the policy consciousness of the country. Now, this is not a point I want to focus only on the government, but the government ultimately is perhaps where we would go to for any recourse in this matter. But the general perception across that somehow it's as if we have a very selective vision that sees only the prosperity of the rich and very rich farmer and their capacity for progress, their capacity to do better, etc., which is natural, and to somehow think of all of agriculture in this through this in these rosy terms. In fact, literally, the truth is very far from it. I have depended a great deal on FAS ground level data and experiences to understand some of these issues. I think we are agreed that there is transformation, there is change, but the overall problems remain. And so I have listed them, and there are two ways in which the problem is not adequately understood in the context of climate change. One is to attribute problems of social and economic structure, institutional governance issues to climate change, or on the other hand, to somehow romanticize the small farmer and see, especially those who are obsessed with mitigation, and see in their lack of inputs, their consumption, in their inability to consume some kind of blueprint for a sustainable future. So both of these are, of course, profoundly incorrect, and it is not useful. But we had remarked on this a decade ago, but this problem somehow seems to have intensified. And so here I think there is very little, in some sense, new to say, but if anything, the problem of the small farmer, the lives and livelihoods of the small farmer, the doubling of productivity and the doubling of incomes for the majority of India's rural population is, still remains the biggest issue, and if anything, its urgency is higher. So I just want to emphasize that. The earlier observations we had from the PARI data, from village level studies, the insights that they provided, all of them, I think, remain very much in place. It is true, I think, however, that productivity overall does rise. I mean, this is not instability of agriculture production is not to be confused with any decline in agriculture production. I think that is the common confusion, and that is not correct. But instability of agriculture production is ever present. So now at this point, I would like to turn a little back, our view back to the global picture, and somehow, there is a feeling sometimes that the global picture is something that is left to policy experts or people who are interested in international issues, and they are not relevant to. Sorry, I just have to get hold of my charger. Otherwise, my lecture will be interrupted. So somehow there is this sort of feeling, which, I must say is, I find profoundly disturbing. So I think all the experts are aware, even if the public is not, and certainly among certainly among economists, among agriculture scientists, among certainly in government, we are fully aware of the importance of what is happening, say, with the Doha round of negotiations at the WTO. Because they impact very seriously our attempts to have public distribution, our attempts in this country over the years, all the twists and turns notwithstanding, of providing some basis in food security, etc. And so the erosion of all that policy flexibility by international pressure is something which is very relevant to the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. So I think to the same extent, perhaps not as immediately, but certainly coming up on the horizon in equally, if not more important way, is this question of what are the global trends and global discourse on climate adaptation in agriculture. So the report on food security and climate change, one of the reports in 2014, that was quite excellent. That really made this point about see, a lot of the work in looking forward to how to go about dealing with climate change impacts and how we must deal with adaptation and mitigation is through modeling scenarios. So, if what will be the impact on yields, if you use more fertilizer, increase productivity, what will be the impact on emissions? All of these kind of issues are put together, mitigation and adaptation, into scenarios, and scientists try to model them. But it was noted very clearly that none of these global scenario efforts attempt to address distributional issues within countries and the possibility that climate change affects the vulnerable disproportionately. Amen. So, they also noted the importance of distributional issues at the global level. In fact, they went further and they spoke about the assumption. It is commonly assumed that small-scale farms are more likely to engage in diversified crop and livestock agriculture, but they say we know too little about how crops and livestock are grown and management practices change with scale to identify global patterns consistently. Then again, they also talk about the vulnerability of small farmers and how critical it is to understand these vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, what has happened is that there has been something of a 180-degree turn in attitude, not only with the FAO, which is unfortunate, but on a larger scale. And that is something that I wish to highlight now. So what are these, where do these policy shifts in climate change and agriculture come from? One is the continuing failure to step up climate mitigation by developed countries. The United States teeters back and forth between presidencies who wish to take climate action and presidencies that threaten climate action. And if the president is willing to undertake climate action, his Congress is unwilling. So that is, nobody talks about it, but this is a glaring fact. The moment there is a crisis like the Ukraine conflict, the Europe and the OECD brethren, they rush to divert all oil and gas. In fact, they stop ships midway in the oceans and turn them around to their shores, leading to conflicts even between themselves. The other thing is, with this kind of attitude, obviously the remaining carbon budget is shrinking rapidly. Most of you would be, I think many of you would be aware that to remain within a particular warming level, meaning rise in temperature about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees over pre-industrial levels, the world has a definite carbon budget. The remaining carbon budget is shrinking rapidly. This was clear even at the time of signing the Paris Agreement. So there is nowhere to go. I mean, so at this point, of course, unfortunately, a section of scientists have started resorting to the idea that somehow you can boost natural resources through mainly afforestation, despite all the fancy language, and you would somehow depend on the biosphere to soak up the emissions that are not declining fast enough from the industrial sector. Now, this, of course, is impossible. This is not going to work. But then, of course, you can do models. So you have this speculative technologies called carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, CCUS. Then you have BECCS, which is carbon capture and storage using bioenergy, then afforestation. Of all these, it's afforestation that works, and to try and cut down emissions in the agriculture sector. But then, of course, where are the resources? The biosphere resources are in the global south, because the north, except, of course, countries like Canada, partly United States, some of them, but a lot of the others, and Europe, which is the most vocal in this kind of policy discourse, have simply wiped out their biodiversity and their natural resources. So whereas the burden to go, it goes to the global south. So this is the background in which this new discourse has begun. So the first is to somehow talk about agriculture not as a productive activity that provides livelihoods, etc., to people, but to look at it from a conservation or ecological viewpoint. Now, this is all very well, but, without the labor of the farmer, without human intervention through manual and mechanical labor, through effort and sweat, there is no way that nature gives us food. So, but on the other hand, this whole conservation discourse and this deep suspicion of modern agriculture, that has, which is the agriculture counterpart of vaccine denial, in the West, this has come together to push framing in purely ecological terms of the issues of climate change and agriculture. Unfortunately, IPCC's working group has not taken a clear stand against it. Okay. And it was with considerable effort by developing countries that there is some balance, but a lot more could have been said, which unfortunately is not made clear in the summary of that report. The second thing is recommending low input, low productivity, and low profitability farming, but it's recommending it in the language of mainstream agricultural science. So they use words like agroecology. Agroecology was a perfectly reasonable term, but now has become associated with a particular way of dealing with the challenge. Now, there are various offshoots of this, and one of them, of course, our own homegrown version, which has been soundly rejected scientifically, is zero budget natural farming. So zero budget natural farming, very surprisingly, not only is favorably mentioned by the FAO in his HLP report number 14, it is not only favorably mentioned by other agencies, it also finds a place in the 5th biodiversity assessment of the Convention on Biodiversity. Now, what is this like? This is like having the UNFCCC praise water divining as a means of looking for groundwater to solve a hydrological problem, which is just that. So unfortunately, but this is gone mainstream. So this is a major issue. Points of view which were marginal in their policy impact now have an entire chapter devoted to them in the IPCC report. And this, the most popular of these is called degrowth. It's, so this whole idea that growth must stop. So, its incoherence in at least for the global south is obvious. So degrowth, and now mainstream climate modelers work on degrowth. Degrowth got its own, not a full chapter maybe, but a very important part of a key chapter on climate resilience was, had a substantial section dealing with degrowth. So this is a characteristic. So major multilateral institutions, as I have already noted, are romanticizing the small farmer while depriving the small farming community of support. Because in this language, you don't need money. It is just some, the natural resources that huge investment in infrastructure, in research, in biotechnology, none of this will then be required because you will simply say everything is available in nature. So this is a very unfortunate trend. And this comes in the background of the fact that adaptation receives a much lower proportion of climate finance, which is available globally, most of it being going for mitigation activities. So this is particularly concerning for the developing countries as a whole. For the continent of Africa and low-income countries everywhere, this is quite serious. Now, a lot of this is taking place in a new version, if you wish, of the limits to growth story, which began in the West many years ago, prior to climate change and the story of sustainable development. The limits to growth idea was that the rise of consumption in China and the United States would drive the world towards ecological and resource decline. Some kind of Malthusian, neo-Malthusian picture. And a common reaction to that was that, you must curb growth in the South, global South. A whole range of climate modeling efforts, which have a very important influence on policy today, and the kind of scenarios they project of the future are dependent on this. So they are dominating, the dominating discourse is that of focusing on keeping it to 1.5 degrees, the temperature increase. But even though it turns out by the same
Professor Jayaraman.
Yes,
Professor
yes, I saw
Yeah.
your message.
Okay.
By the same models, you find that if you have unmitigated, efforts at mitigation and without equity, because that is characteristic of these models, they don't project an unequal world, there will be a rise of hunger. So in fact, my colleagues, Srija and Arvindan and Akhil have done an analysis of some of these models, those which talk about, provide some projections for the future on the population at risk of hunger, and there are simply a startling amount of hunger that is projected for the future at risk of hunger. And in fact, they point out in their paper that it is, in fact, there is no class of scenarios which are the kind of information which is being used at UNFCCC negotiations, etc., which project a world of zero hunger by 2050 or even by 2100. Most of them ignore the issue, the bulk of them, or at least half of them. But those who do take account of it, none of them has a scenario of a world free of hunger. So I think these are very important issues. So there are a number of policy confusions. Perhaps, there would be, there are popular ones like farmer suicide directly correlated to climate change. So there is all these, wise men of Berkeley or other such places, wise men and women, if I may say so, who determine that, if you will have so many more suicides per 100,000 of population if temperature rises by 1 degree. Really, I mean, no, we have written critiques of that. So these are, some of the issues. There is a new discourse out there where I think neither the insights of 70 years of development economics nor the insights of 70 years of agricultural science are being applied in the right fashion in the present. And I think it has to do with the political pressures which have arisen around the question of climate mitigation, of the challenge of keeping temperatures to sustainable levels, 1.5, maybe 2 degrees centigrade warming. But in this process, I think there is much confusion in the field of climate change and agriculture and the larger discourse, which needs our careful attention. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. V.K. Singh, may I invite you to kindly moderate the question answers and followed by your own chair's address.
Okay. First of all, thanks to organizer for giving me this opportunity to listen a very learned personality, Dr. Jayaraman, in the field of climate change. He has the best expertise, not only nationally, globally is known in the field of these field. So it was not only chairing a session, it is a kind of learning to me, and I hope many of us has learned many new things. I appreciate the things as very nicely presented, very comprehensively told how it's climate change going to impact in Indian context. I will come on the briefs of the presentation in at later on, but before that, I would like to have, there are so many questions. I see there are 10 questions, 100 participants. So that's a good interest is there. This lecture got generated a very good interest among the participants, and I will be read out, and wherever appropriate, I think Dr. Jayaraman will join to reply. The questions, first question is from Sudeshna. In recent time, there is a growing understanding that the genesis of stubble burning crisis in Punjab can be traced back to Green Revolution. How do you view on this? Dr. Jayaraman, I would like to put something.
Yes, and the stubble burning is hardly, stubble burning is hardly a discovery of the Green Revolution, and so and it is not. See, I mean, how should I say this? And this sort of nobody says stubble burning is good. But stubble burning, and see, the burning of the crop remainder, the burning of vegetation to clear space for crops, it goes back to ancient times in human history. Sweden agriculture, all kinds of things. Now, stubble burning is, it takes place in some parts of the country. It doesn't take place in other parts of the country. It is not what is meant by can be traced back is not very clear. You can have a green revolution kind of impact in rise in production and productivity without stubble burning happens in other parts of the world. So clearly, there is a particular set of circumstances for getting rid of the remainder of the crop in the field after the useful part has been harvested and crop residue that is usable has been taken away. There is a certain circumstance, social and economic, and technical, in which it happens. So you can't say trace it back to the Green Revolution. It's not like that. I mean, so
yeah. We got your point. In fact, Green Revolution came, but there are so many ill effects, and that one of them is this Green Revolution, the high stature crops, more residue, particularly rice burning is there. But I would like to add here, without thinking if you are doing any practice, that will not sustainable in long run. Similarly, this residue burning, the soils of Punjab, Haryana, and Western IGP, they are depleting in many nutrients. Had it been recycled properly, the microbial activity would have been better. The availability of nutrient, potassium, sulfur, and whatever is lying in the residue that goes to go back to the soil. So many technologies like conservation agriculture, happy seeder, tools and techniques has come up. So those are doing, but needs to be promote those things in a bigger way. And that will not only Green Revolution, that can make it evergreen revolution. So thank you, Dr. Jayaraman. I will take another.
Let me add here, I think, an important point. I think in the context, see, it's very important not to confuse issues of local pollution with climate change. The climate change is not local pollution, you know. So there is a distinction. People say, you know, there's a tendency to confuse the two in order to promote mitigation, but I think that is incorrect. So stubble burning is a local pollution issue and has to be dealt with in a number of ways. Okay, next.
The another, we are grateful that Dr. K. Suresh, he has given one very good publication. He shared an economic analysis of agriculture adaptation to climate change impact in Sri Lanka and endogenous switching regression analysis. So we are grateful to you, Dr. Suresh, for sharing it. Hope our friends will be downloading and they will read out. But the same context, Tanuj has asked one question that what is the rationale for your method of measuring yield gaps? How did you measure your yield gap? They wanted to know, Dr.
So basically, as I said, it's a very straightforward point we are making. So based on rainfall and evapotranspiration rates, the country can be classified into 5 or 6 climatic zones. For each climatic zone, you look at the district which has the highest yield of a particular crop. You take that as the reference level. Then all the other district by district, you see what is their yield. And you look at the difference between this and the maximal yield in a district in that climatic zone. So that is the simple thing. See, you can put more conditions. So you can put the nature of the soil, you can add to the story. So you can add other variables to constrain this thing. But then I think it stops being useful, because by that token, you can constrain everything so that every local area, whatever yield it has, you will end up saying that that is optimal. So I think we looked at broadly the climatic rainfall and evapotranspiration rates. And based on that, what is the potential for yield increase? That is the rationale. Okay.
Yeah. And the modeling approach we use in this climate change impact, the different parameters, put and climate and local, the climate settings, agroecological settings, I can say, that use, and accordingly potential we measure and how much we are getting in real field situation. So that gap is the real yield gap. And we not
this
don't
is,
take...
Dr. Singh, we have not here used the model potential yield.
Yeah. This is the real field situation, means how much yield you are getting and the gap between attainable yield and the farmer's field. Yeah, that's fine. So that's a very practical approach you are taking. Yeah. The another question arises from Mr. Ajit. He's asking that how do you measure this climate smart agriculture program in terms of its impact of the technologies? He wanted to know that how emission per unit yield, how you calculate, and what should be our trend in if you calculate like this, and what is the impact of our programs to lowering the emissions. I would like to add here that the climate smart in Indian context, we tell it climate resilient agriculture. Resilient means Indian, as is mentioned, was made by Dr. Jayaraman, the Indian farmers, 86% farmers are smallholder. And their farming is not only crop, they go for other enterprises, crop, dairy, horticulture, fishery, poultry, duckery, anything. So smart is not appropriately, it can be used in Indian context. It should be, if it is smart, it is focused for one crop and one technology, but not a bundle of technology. So we are assessing the climate resilient program, which we do at national level. And here we see the emission, there are locations where we system-based emissions, how much occurring, that we determine. There is proper protocol for that. Crop-wise system-based emissions in different ecologies. Also, there are the IPCC constant values that we use for seeing the overall emission per unit of any grain production. So that that sort of information, that is again that can be calibrated. So for that matter, research is still going on, but some of the for rice, wheat, and maize, those constant we have worked out, but many crops still we have to have. So that constant we are using from IPCC. Dr. Jayaraman, would like to add anything on it?
Yeah, see, there are 2 points I want to make. One is there are a number of efforts which are being used or let me put it this way. First, we have to understand what is the policy focused in India, what it should be in terms of agriculture emissions. So India's objective, which I think is correct, and previous governments as well as the current government have always followed this. We are not focused on reduction of emissions as such in absolute terms. We are focused in reducing emissions intensity of production. However, India made it very clear, this was way back in 2011 or 12, India made it very clear that even after Cancun in 2011 climate summit, when it gave a target for emissions intensity, meaning how much emissions per unit of GDP, it made it clear that agriculture emissions are not part of the story. So, minimizing emissions per unit yield, even in agriculture, is not something on which India has a formal international commitment because of the the general conditions, socio-economic conditions of our agriculture does not permit the putting of any such pressure. However, nevertheless, as a matter of lowering input use, as a matter of, because it is always useful for farmers, both in terms of costs and in terms of resource availability, to optimize their water input, optimize fertilizer input, etc., pesticide input, etc. So in this process, there are co-benefits, as we call it, associated benefits, where emissions are also low. Okay. So that is the context in which emissions reduction per unit yield is discussed. They are, wherever such initiatives are tested, like for instance, nano urea is one. There is direct seeding of rice, alternate wetting and drying in rice. There are then in some places SRI, system of rice intensification has been practiced. In all these, wherever these are practiced, the data is collected, and the Department of Agriculture actually has data on estimates are made as to how much emissions reduction are potentially achieved. And this is actually listed and recorded in the biennial update reports of the Government of India submitted to UNFCCC. So you can look it up there, see how these are measured. ICAR has people and scientists who are engaged in quantifying these emissions, and so when new technologies are being tested, how they provide reduction in emissions per unit yield is available and researched by them. So that is the point. So you can look up the third biennial update report of the Government of India submitted to UNFCCC, and that will have the latest figures on some of these technologies.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jayaraman. Very well explained. The biennial report, we do these all calculations and the emissions. The another question is from Dr. Sudhir Goyal. How there is no solution in sight at present to mitigate the risk for the smallholder, and whether this there is this crop insurance which he is saying that not so effective. So what will be the option and how it can be implemented? I would like to mention here that it's not like that. There are so many plans Government of India has implemented. You might have heard this NMSA, National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture. It has 10 different components for different enterprises and different technologies in agriculture. And that has largely impacted this, and the smallholder system, in fact, it's not only crop production, many other enterprises. So as a whole, it is being taken care. Regarding the risk is concerned, yes, I agree with that. But the government is also taking care of that. The crop insurance schemes, of course, there are some ifs and buts. But Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana is now being made more dynamic. The government is thinking in differently, using the hyperspectral imaging, the what sort of losses happening and how much it can be quickly it can be provided to the farmer to cope up the situations. So those sort of measures being started. Of course, if you are beginning something, there may be some issues in it at beginning, but things are being taken care. And as regarding the risk is, the risk is always there because we cannot control the climate, but we can go for adaptation, suitable adaptation measures. And we have proved in our NICRA villages in 151 clusters, though wherever it was, their risk was minimal. The resilient score was very, very high. So for that matter, we should read out the publications brought out under that program, NICRA. Climate resilient technologies for state-wise, district-wise, are several states, 7 states I know, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Assam, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, Rajasthan, were worked out. So if you really implement those things, these risks can be minimized and it will be more fruitful to the smallholders. I will go to the next topic.
But Dr. Singh,
yeah,
I am looking at the questions on the Q&A box. So what I will do now is I'll take some of the questions. I will predict, I'll sort of club them and quickly run through a few answers. Otherwise, we go sequentially. It'll be, I think it'll get very late, and you will also be delayed as you have. Eventually, you'll have to leave also.
Professor Jayaraman, you take a few questions that you wish to, and then we'll also share all the questions with you on the email, so that for subsequently, if you would like to answer some of them. So 1 or 2 questions you can choose to take up now, and then we can close the session.
Yes. I think that's a good suggestion. So one question which struck me, and I think it's, I didn't have time to elaborate on this whole shift from talking about agriculture, crop production, and this whole talk of food systems. So everywhere now people are talking about food systems, and it has become very popular. Now, unfortunately, the problem with the food system view is, and I think for Global South it is very serious, is that it conflates the input supply chain and those who own it and those who profit from it or benefit from it. And it confuses the input supply chain and the output supply chain, the output chain, like there will be traders, there will be, it can go all the way to retailers, there is a whole, structure. It confuses those players with the farmer. And especially in the Indian, anywhere in the world, I think, to compare the power of the Walmarts or, other such agencies with or the big pesticide and what should I say, and seed multinationals, the big five or big three of grain trading, etc. with farmers is, I think, is simply not done. And so, this whole idea somehow that you think of it as a food system, and somehow that is on par is, I think, a very problematic idea. And especially in the context of India, I think it really confuses things. So I must say that third world developing countries are very reluctant to use this term. As we saw at COP27, and Dr. Singh, you were there also.
Yeah.
There was much agreement that food system, whenever developed country people said, oh, it should be food system, we developing countries, people would say, yes, we will see about that in the future. So really it's a very problematic idea, and it confuses the vulnerability of the poor with the responsibilities for mitigation of the rich, and that is simply problematic. I don't want to comment on particular techniques like in agroforestry, etc. Agroforestry is fine, but the whole idea of agroecology has gone beyond some practical things that you do. It has become something of an ideology. I have, which glorifies lack of technology. Basically, as I said, it glorifies low input, low productivity agriculture. That, to my mind, is very problematic. Romanticizes the absence of scale, and all of these are issues. So that is the the use of the term agroecology that I objected to, and that was precisely my point. You take a term which has a reasonable meaning and you use it in a context that is problematic. So then let me see. I will wind up just very quickly. Now, anonymous state or not. See, there is a whole issue about reaching out to the farmer that has come up in several ways. One is, of course, I think our agriculture extension needs strengthening. And I think in the era of climate change, agriculture extension needs the active intervention of the state. So I think we need to relook at our agriculture extension system, and we need to repurpose it. Unfortunately, there is too much pressure coming from the private players, international players, and the international NGOs to convert agriculture extension into purely climate thing. It won't work. This is simple fact. You can put all the money you want behind it. It is not going to work. The farmer is interested in having his crops grow. So you can't lecture him on climate change or what they call, climate resilience manager, climate smart manager. Yes, getting people to appreciate climate variability, the farmers, telling them how to handle data, how to use data providing facilities so that they can cope with climate variability is important. But it must go hand in hand with the agriculture extension in the usual sense of the term. And I think to bring these two features together, learning to cope with climate variability and at the same time keep production and productivity going up is the challenge. Countries
disconnected.
Yeah.
We'll try and get them back.
Yeah. So I think those are the two questions I wanted to sort of quickly make a point about. Extension remains very important, must be repurposed, and I think is very important to make farmers climate aware is also to tell them how to improve production, productivity, and income. So I think that's this thing. Later, there are other questions. So probably from MSSRF, if we have occasion, we might, in collaboration with FAS, if FAS would be interested, have a more, shall we say, a pedagogical lecture rather than this kind of limited lecture. So perhaps that will be an occasion I can answer some of your questions. So that is for later. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jayaraman, for very nicely responding the questions, major questions. Almost we addressed, and if anything left, those are in Q&A box. Please go through and give the answer to reply. Any in future also, you can have any query pertains to the lecture, you can ask to Dr. Jayaraman. Overall, I find this whole lecture was very interesting. And the points we raised very pertinent to Indian context, such as the impact of climate change, how it is happening, how it is going to affect the agriculture as a whole in the country, rainfall, other in the extremes in terms of flood or heat waves or the cold waves, salt stress, multiple stresses are there. Those things are very, very pertinent to Indian agriculture because it's a highly diversified country, diversified system. So that way, the ways by which the impact was mentioned, that was very useful. The smallholders system, which occupies a large chunk in the country, 86%, more than 86% now, I can say. is also very important, and it was very well explained that the mitigation should not be emphasized for the countries like India and other in developing countries, and the burden of the developed nations should not be put over the farmers, smallholders, farmers, poor farmers like India. So that point was also very well described, and the means and measures how it can do well in Indian context, farmers' viewpoint and the policy viewpoint was also taken a due consideration, and the important point was highlighted like the instability of agriculture production. How instability we are measuring. Many times people say that this instability is directly linked with the climate change. It's not, it's a weather phenomenon which decides, and I find, for example, drought. Drought is a slow process. It may occur after some time of crop production, but not it's every time it doesn't come. So this kind of processes are there, but frequency is increasing, of course. That has the major consideration. But the production stability, we have to see in long term how much it is and how the climate variations pushing it. That has to be relationship between the variations in the climate, weather aberrations, climate aberrations, and yield. Then we can establish how the yields are going to impact it. The points during the presentation, like addressing the vulnerability using the multiple approach or integrated farming system approach, where not only crop, along with the crop, the livestock and other enterprises we take care. So that was a very important point, which is most suiting to the smallholder to making more Indian agriculture sustainable in long run. The points, few points like shift in policy for climate change in agriculture, those were very, very pertinent. In fact, Dr. Jayaraman has been there for 27, and there are a lot of push for mitigation. The making burden the country like India, the mitigation, though country is not signatory, not part of this NDC, but they were pushing, the developed nations are pushing to have this mitigation, and it is no doubt it will not be going to make Indian agriculture sustainable, especially our food security concern will be there. So that sort of policy shift we are seeing, but Indian context, government has initiated a lot of things on that perspective. NMSA is one. Recently, the government is started a carbon credit cell in Ministry of Agriculture. So if we are sequestering carbon in any type of production system, that incentivization to those farmers and those entrepreneurs will be there. That sort of new studies being initiated, and also at large scale, technological backstopping being provided from different means. It's not only government of India, even the state governments are also coming up very well. The Maharashtra government launched the POKRA program, the Bihar government launched the CRA program, and the Andhra Pradesh Ponda Sanjeevani, and many of the states have implemented to address the climate change issues. And the ultimate goal is to reduce the GHG emission and have more carbon sequestration without endangering the resource base as well as our productivity. Productivity should sustain in long run with positive mode. So these are some of the points, and during the question and answer session, I find there was excellent ideas coming to our participants. They have asked many good questions. Some of them were responded and responded very well about the food systems and the zero budget agriculture and natural resource, the nanotechnology and all these things. They are new dimensions and which have ultimate goals to address the issues of climate change. So I think this whole lecture as well as discussion was very, very fruitful, and it was a kind of more and more richness in our knowledge, reaching our knowledge. And with this, I thanks again to Dr. Jayaraman to enlightening all of us on the very key areas which is being discussed globally. And your lecture was not a lecture which has a local importance. I will say it has a global importance. And it shows how Indians research, how Indian agriculture withstand in global scenario, and what should be our next future plan to overcome the issues of climate change. I thanks to organizer for giving this opportunity again, and our key listeners. There were more than 100 participants. I thanks to them for sparing their time, and hope these lessons gained from this presentation lecture. You will be ambassador tomorrow for climate change adaptation strategy in the country like India. Thank you. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Sorry, just give me this. Yeah, thank you very much, sir. We are at the end of the program, and we shall finish the program with a vote of thanks. The foundation has been trying to promote platforms for the coming together of agricultural science, technology, and social science for facilitating a constructive interaction between them for some time. And in our opinion, this lecture will prove to be another step in that direction. For that, we are very thankful to Professor Jayaraman for agreeing to a lecture, to give a lecture such as this, and for giving us a very important and nuanced picture of the prevailing discourses on climate change and agriculture in developing countries in general. We are grateful to Dr. Vinod Singh for accepting our request to chair the lecture. Sir, we are thankful to you for conducting today's lecture amid a very busy schedule. We are also thankful to Dr. Singh's office for their efforts in facilitating the conduct of this lecture. We are thankful to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their generous support in conducting the event. I thank the online team at FAS, Sandeepan, Tapas, Sethu, and Komal for their support in conducting this lecture smoothly. Last but not the least, I thank the attendees for their very active participation and for raising pertinent questions that have made this session an engaging one. Unfortunately, there is only limited time for us to be able to take up all the questions that were raised during the lecture. We have noted down all your questions and will be sending them to Professor Jayaraman. We shall write back to you individually with responses. The recording of this lecture will be made available on our YouTube channel in the near future. You can find the recordings of our previous events, including the highly popular Young Scholars Seminar series on the channel also. So please do visit and take a look at them. To know more about the work that we do, visit our website, fas.org.in. We're also on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn at FAS Agri Studies. You can follow us there as well to understand the work that we do. With this, we will be ending the session with this. Once again, thank you very much for your continuous participation throughout the time the lecture has gone on for. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.